Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Know Your Rights. Today, we're going to be covering entrapment. So, what is entrapment? At its core, it's a scenario in which police officers coerce or push someone to commit a crime they wouldn't normally commit. So, if the defendant, as arrested as a result of this crime committed, can prove that they were entrapped, it's a really powerful legal defense in court. So, there are a few standards that scenarios must meet to be considered entrapment. So, first of all, the police or their agents must do more than offer the opportunity to commit a crime for it to be considered entrapment. There's a general expectation by judges that normal people will resist the temptation to commit crimes. Second of all, police officers or their agents must use coercive actions which lead to the commission of the crime. Some examples of these actions include threats or harassment. So let's take this example. Jim is just a regular person on the street, just a normal guy, and he's approached by an undercover police officer posing as a gang member and is offered a large sum of money to transport cocaine for a few blocks. If Jim does it, this cannot be considered entrapment as there was no pressure on Jim to accept the offer. However, if the undercover police officer threatened Jim with violence or pressured him otherwise, in his role as a gang member, this would definitely constitute entrapment, since normal people would seek to avoid violence from dangerous criminals. The key difference between these two scenarios is the pressure from the undercover police officer. A regular person wouldn't agree to transport drugs from a gang member unless there was the threat of violence involved. So, what's considered entrapment differs between states. There are two standards for entrapments, depending on which state you're being tried in. So, the first is the objective standard, which, when you're in court looking at the evidence offered by the defendant, the jury must judge if the actions of the police would have pushed a normal person to commit a crime. Next to that is the subjective standard, in which the jury must decide whether the defendant's character and tendency to commit crimes are responsible for the crime committed, without considering the effects of police actions. Obviously, states with the subjective standards are tougher on defendants who try and use the entrapment defense because they look beyond what the police do. In an objective state, if the police pressured you to commit a crime, that's entrapment. In a subjective state, they would look at things like, your character, your criminal record, your tendency to commit crimes to try and see if the police officers really had any effect and whether or not you would have committed the crime anyway. So let's take another look at another example. So Tim, a career criminal, so he's got a record, is arrested for a home invasion alongside members of a local gang and an undercover police officer, which he participated in because a police officer continually pressured him and implied that if he didn't participate, the other members would hurt him as a result. So in an objective standard state, the police officer's coercion would lead the jury to rule Tim, innocent under the entrapment standard. However, in a subjective standard state, the jury wouldn't automatically rule this case innocent under entrapment because they would consider Tim's past convictions, his tendency to commit crimes, and whether or not he would have gone through with the crime anyway, regardless of police interference. So an important thing to note is that the entrapment defense only works if entrapment is committed by police officers or their agents, such as, undercover informants and confidential informants, right? So being pressured into a crime by a real gang member, a real criminal, or any other private citizen does not result in an entrapment defense. Another really important thing to note is that entrapment is an affirmative defense, which means that as a defendant, the burden of proof is on you to prove that you were entrapped. As opposed to this assumption of innocence, you can't assume that you were entrapped. You must prove it and must present to the jury and the court evidence that you were entrapped. So if you believe that you were entrapped or you believe you found yourself in this scenario, the most important thing to do is present all pertinent evidence to your attorney and tell them the entire story, because since the burden of proof is on you, you must maximize your chances to prove that you were entrapped. Otherwise, you may find yourself entrapped and jailed for a crime that you might otherwise not commit. So I really appreciate everyone watching this video. And I hope you found it informative, and I hope you return for episode 4 of Know Your Rights.